It's almost like God has heard the prayers of saints for decades who have been praying for this land, and something is waking up. And here's evidence of it. It's not just anecdotal stories that we're telling or you're hearing in this podcast. It's published polls and news outlets that are going, we've got to tell there's something happening. God is doing something. It's not a clever church strategy or a clever leader. It almost feels like leaderless. It feels like there's a generation who are stepping up, going after something.
Welcome everybody, this is Simon Guillebaud with Inspired. Great to be back for another fantastic week of encouragement. If you're new to us, I'm sick to death of being bombarded by the relentless barrage of negativity in the press. You know, if you're watching the news too much, you're just letting someone else curate all the bad stuff to make you more depressed and cynical and anxious. So that's why I think this podcast is doing so well, because you just get to meet different mates of mine from across the spectrum of different careers and life experience. And I've got no doubt that in an hour's time, you will leave with hopefully a vicarious smile of joy at just hearing what is going on right now in a certain part of London, and also through the ministry in general of Pete Wynter. Welcome, Pete.
Simon, thank you. It's great to be here with you.
Yeah, wonderful. So Pete and I, we reckon, go back about 10 years. He was, a previous incarnation, one of his big life chapters was as the founder of One Life, which had a vision basically to raise up young people and equip them to lead in every sphere of society. So we connected. I spoke at one of his conferences back in Chorleywood about a decade ago. He now leads.
He did. It was great as well. So we loved that. It was good. My story with you goes before that, but you wouldn't know that because you did those discipleship videos.
Go on.
More Than Conquerors, is that right?
Mm-hmm, that's right.
Yeah. So I used that. When I was a youth minister, I used a load of those and was inspired and provoked. So thank you for your inspiration in that moment, in that season. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks for that encouragement. Well, now you are leading St. Paul's Hammersmith with your wife, Sarah, and I wanted to get you on because there's so much great stuff going on. We were together at the New Wine Leadership Conference in February, where you gave one of the main talks there, and some of the stories were just mind-blowing. So looking forward to hearing more of those. But let's go back, Pete. Don't know much about your background, childhood, anything significant there?
Yeah, no, I mean, I had a, broadly speaking, a happy childhood. I grew up in a home where, I was taken to church, mum and dad, and two brothers, which was great. But I don't think I really didn't really own my faith. And actually, probably, I'd say when I was like 11 or 12, was kind of drifting off, which happens a lot for young people, doesn't it? So I was like off on my own direction and getting into other things and not that interested. And I'll never forget I've got two older brothers, or had. One of them has sadly died, which might be part of the story. But Mark, who sadly died, he kind of had come to Christ and was suddenly saying, I'm a Christian. I'm like, I always thought we were a Christian, because there was this kind of background thing, but it was kind of quiet and gentle and sort of, a bit in the background really of life, and definitely not in the forefront of my mind. And he said, I've become a Christian. I'm like, what on earth do you mean? And that began a bit of interest. At the same time, my dad was in business, kind of in big business, and was traveling 6 months of the year. He was away a lot, quite stressed, quite full on. I didn't see a lot of him until I was 13. And then suddenly he decided, I'm leaving business and I'm going to become a vicar. And I'm like,
oh, wow.
You are not the kind of person I ever expected to be a vicar. And I'm not sure, and I didn't really like it, to be honest. As a grumpy 13-year-old, I was like, you are not vicar material. I'm not interested in that. Why is my brother saying he's become a Christian? What is all this going on about? I got dragged along to a Christian union in my school. It was an all-boys school in High Wycombe. And I went along, and it was packed with about 50 lads, and it was just a prayer meeting, but they were like praying like they really meant it, and like God was actually listening, and like something was happening. And I think it's the first time for me it registered like, oh, is God actually there? Is there something real? These guys actually believe it. What do I think? And I was confronted, and that was about the age of 14. And that, over the course, I can't tell you a date or a moment when I committed my life to Christ, but over the course of a couple of months there, I woke up to the reality that this is the real deal, and God is really moving in people's lives, and something is happening. And some extraordinary things happened in that school, which set me off really. And that's where I began kind of walking with Jesus. And here I am now, like you say, I'm become a vicar, and I'm based here in Hammersmith and lead the church with my wife, Sarah.
So was it steady progress through teenage years, university?
Mostly. I mean, people who were close to me would say, there were some ups and downs, and there definitely were. But, I think from the age of 14, I became quite resolute of like, okay, I want to live my life for Jesus, and I really, really want to work this out. And I had other things that would distract me. There were moments where, some of the relationship stuff was a bit messy through those teenage years. But actually, I just mentioned my brother. I think he spent some time in Africa, And that was amazing. And I think that kind of fueled faith as well, listening to the stories of that. But when he came back, he actually was diagnosed with a brain tumor at the age of 21. So when I was 16, we went through this kind of major grief moment as a family. And it was really challenging, actually, and particularly for my parents and my older brother and others around. And I mean, the miracle was that he recovered. He wasn't expected to. And I remember seeing him in the hospital desperately ill, and having been a really sporty, active, physical guy, he was sort of reduced to just nothing really. I mean, it really ravaged his body. And as I say, wasn't really expected to pull through it. He did. And that was amazing. But actually, in the end, Mark did end up dying later on when he was in his early 30s. It came back, and after some incredible stuff that he had done, he had gone and sort of served with his wife in Uganda as a missionary and doing amazing things and stunning stuff. And, you know, and he got re-diagnosed when he came back for a visit to London. And, you know, I'll never forget him leaning across the sofa, you know, about 20 years ago. This was, you know, at Christmas time, you know, with a bobble hat on, his body ravaged again. It's really struggling. But we sort of thought, oh, he's going to get through it. And he leant forwards and he said, oh, Pete, God's called me on another adventure. And I just thought, oh, this guy is so full of vision and passion and wonder, and like, look, gosh, he's been called to the ends of the earth and kind of really remote areas in the Runesbury mountains and serving God. And now he's got another adventure while he's pulling through like really tough things. And it wasn't until a month later that I realized he was talking about being called home. And you know, I think he knew that God was calling him home. And of course, that was a desperately sad time. And for me, at the end of that time, really for the years before that, you know, lots of friends who had died in unusual circumstances and difficult things. So when you say, oh, was it just an upward trajectory from there? You know, I think faith was upward trajectory, but it wasn't without its battles and challenges and sadnesses and upsets and the complexities of that cause loads of questions and challenge. So, you know, that sort of seasoned lots of my growing and having to work out, well, how do you process this alongside faith and being expectant for God to move alongside a sense of loss or sadness? And that was a lot of that characterized my 20s.
My university years were pretty key and foundational. Did you have any big moments then? Yeah,
I think I sort of began tasting almost like a hunger for God in those years. I was training to become a teacher, and I really knew that God had called me to teach in that season. And I loved going in and out of schools and doing different things. And I, you know, I guess just after university, I lived this kind of interesting experience down in Devon where I was a prison chaplain at the weekend. So I was working with young offenders who had kind of ended up behind bars. Whilst then I started getting involved in a little private school. I hadn't intended to do that, especially, but I then ended up going in there, and the headmaster said, "Oh, you're a Christian. I'm a sort of quiet Christian, but not like you. And I've got 2 years before I retire, and I want to leave this place with a greater sense of faith than it has had, and certainly now it feels like a low ebb. So will you come?" And so I sort of said, "Okay." And so I ended up actually getting a job there. So I was like teaching midweek to little private school, primary school children, and then I was in prison at the weekends, different ends of kind of what was going on in kind of the Southwest. But in both places saw God moving amazingly. And so we're seeing like, I just want to encourage all the teachers out there. But I mean, it was just a real move, really. Over the course of a couple of years, saw about 50 kids give their lives to Jesus in that school context. And then, and that was really special and came with its battles and challenges, but it was amazing seeing this kind of emerging Christian Union, Youth Alphas stuff begin to happen. It was a small school, like 200 pupils. So suddenly, like at one stage, you know, you're getting, you know, near on a quarter of the school who are really engaging in the things of God. And the same happening in the prison. You know, and again, I was just very part-time as a chaplain there, but I got key trained, and, you know, what on earth was I doing? I was only like 22, 23 at the time, and these kind of young offenders, but there wasn't a single chapel service where young people were not coming to Christ, 15 to 21-year-olds. And over the course of a couple of years, we saw with a great friend of mine, Greg Downs, you know, who I was good friends with there and was serving alongside. He was the main chaplain. I think you know him as well. But yeah, I think, you know, saw around 500 young people come to Christ over the course of a couple of years there as well. So, I mean, there were some amazing things that were going on that I think all was sowing in me, oh God, you are on the move. You heal, you save, you deliver, you want to break in, and you're doing extraordinary things. And gosh, I'm getting old, but this was like just over 20 years ago. It didn't feel like that was even the main narrative in the church, or everything felt quite hard. Everything felt difficult to me anyway. And it felt like, the church is on the back foot. It's in decline. We're not seeing a huge amount break through. It feels like atheism's on the rise. Everything's really hard. So to see those two things in those little pockets, again, I think God was saying something's possible. And it definitely sowed a desire for awakening. Desire for revival, a desire for a sense of like, oh God, you are on the move, you can do these things, you do these things. And I began reading loads about revival history, began reading loads about that, not just in revival history, but biblical revival history, and seeking to try and understand what would it look like for God to break out and do something extraordinary in our day. So those were key moments for me in my kind of student days and early 20s.
And did you expect that you're going to end up as a teacher forever?
No, I didn't. Well, actually, when I was 18, I did a gap year for a church. And during that year, through all the highs and lows and ups and downs and the things I got right and many things I probably got wrong, I felt a real call into youth ministry, actually. And so I sort of grappled, do I go into the church, into the church straight away or not? And I just felt like God said, no, I want you to train to teach. So I did. But I sort of did it kicking and screaming. I didn't really want to end up as a teacher. And even when I qualified, I was like, Lord, I don't really want to teach. I want to get into youth ministry and church ministry. I feel like you're calling me there. And just as I was praying about that headmaster I mentioned actually phoned me, because I'd already been doing a bit of work in that school, and he phoned me and said, listen, can we sort of make a bit of a role here? You'll have to do some classroom teaching with, in these contexts, which is probably not your passion, but I'll basically back you, and 100% whatever you want to do Christian-wise, I'm up for it. And so that was the invitation. And I just thought, well, God, you've made a way for me to do youth ministry and teaching, so I'll do that. And that's what I did for a couple of years. At the end of that 2 years, I then ended up taking a role as the youth minister at a church in Chorleywood, where you ended up turning up. And so I became youth minister at St Andrews in Chorleywood.
Well, go on, tell us about the One Life journey and, the best stories. I'm sure you got loads of stories that fruitful time. Yeah,
it was really special emerging. I think when I got to Chorleywood, and this might be true for lots of people listening, sometimes you turn up somewhere and you think, I've got no idea what I'm doing. How am I going to do this job? How am I going to make this thing happen? Whether it's in teaching or youth ministry or business or politics, whatever you're in. And I sort of turned up thinking, I feel called to this, and I think God's in it, but I've got no idea really. And I just thought, I'm just going to do what happened for me. And I think what happened for me when I became a Christian in that school at the age of 14, that's when it came alive for me. I was just thrown in the deep end a bit, and somebody said, right, in 2 weeks' time, you're leading a Bible study group. And I'm like, I've got no idea. But it drove me to my knees to pray. And I started reading the Bible because I thought, well, I better read the Bible if I'm going to lead a Bible study group. And of course, I look back now and I think there was more strategy in it than I understood. At the time, I just thought, you're throwing me in the deep end. But, there were guys who were a few years older than me who were like intentionally raising up younger leaders. And I was like, okay, that's what happened for me. So, with the few young people that are knocking around the church, and it was when I started, it was a bit of a low ebb. The church had been through a few tough years, and the youth ministry had been through a few tough years as well. And so when I started, it was a low ebb, and there weren't that many young people around. And I just thought, well, Lord, you've given us these few. I'll try and invest and try and release them into leading and try and give them confidence. And so it was a lot of mentoring and some training, and then beginning to say, hey, well, listen, you lead the Bible study, or you do the thing. And bit by bit it grew. I think they got huge ownership, and I got a sense of, belonging to it. Anyway, long story short, one thing led to another, and more young people started coming. Again, not because of me leading it, but because these young people were leading it, and they were bringing their friends because they were excited about bringing their friends to it. And so stuff really grew, and we went through a season of significant growth for a few years where we were seeing young people there was one year particularly where teenagers gave their lives to Jesus every single week without fail. Yeah, and we saw, unlikely young people walking through the doors, giving their lives to Jesus. And then these young people, as we trained and supported, leading things. And so it would get to the point where we were doing these kind of training sessions for young leaders, and then they were doing it. And so on a youth group night, it got to the point where I was like, I'm not doing anything. I'm just going around a number of different locations where at one point we had sort of 13 or 14 different kind of youth ministries running all run by teenagers, supported by adults, but all run by teenagers. And I would spend my time in the car going between all these different locations of kind of village halls and schools and people's homes where these sort of missional communities were happening, led by teenagers. As something was going on to the point, at its height, there were sort of 250, 300 teenagers involved in what was going on. And that was the birth of One Life, because then people started going, well, what are you doing to raise up young leaders? And of course, my answer was, I've got no idea. I don't know. I don't really know, except like we're just encouraging them, training them a bit and trying to give them vision for that. And then just getting behind them and clapping them and cheering them on and giving them confidence. And so some of the training things we did turned into a conference, and that conference gathered momentum. And so suddenly youth groups started coming from other places who wanted to learn that. And that conference turned into what we called One Life. Well, it was Young Leaders Conferences initially, then it turned into One Life. And One Life is still now up and running. It's as you said at the beginning, it's a young leaders training organization that's designed to try and help young people to lead in every sphere of society. Because one of the things I learned in the early days is, those first few conferences, we just trained young people to lead Bible studies and lead worship and lead their friends to Jesus and stuff. And I remember sitting there one time thinking, this is great. I love this. But actually 95% of these teenagers in a few years' time are not going to be working in the church. They're going to be working in politics and education, arts, media. They'll be building families, all those stuff. And perhaps we should be approaching this with a broader sense of this isn't just about helping you become the next youth pastor or worship leader. This is about equipping you to lead well wherever God calls you to lead. And the underlying principle of that as well is that I was recognizing, like, as I was reading all this revival history and longing for God to move, I'm like, God, if that's going to happen, it's going to happen in businesses, in hospitals, in schools, on the streets. This is not contained to the church. And so we have to help try and get a whole bunch of people ready to lead and steward that. If that starts happening and then they're knocking on the doors of churches looking for vicars, there are not going to be enough church leaders or vicars to make all that happen. They've got to be confident to say, great, something's kicking off in my school. I know what I'm doing. Something's kicking off in the corridors in the hospital. I know what I'm doing. I can lead well here. Whatever it is. And that was the heartbeat, really. And so that's when One Life began to kind of orientate itself around saying, okay, yes, of course, we're training people for ministry, but it's ministry everywhere, and a greater confidence that God could use me in my sport, in my work, in my family, and I could steward and move of His Spirit in that place. And so that's always been the undergirding desire of any leadership development I've done, is actually how do we prepare people to steward awakening and revival?
Well, I'm hoping a whole bunch of youth leaders, people invested in that sphere of being challenged right now, thinking, yeah, no, certainly we're not into babysitting, we're not into entertaining, are we? We want to equip and release and empower.
No way. And it's an important thing to challenge us on, isn't it? Like, because again, we can slip into that, sort of offering some sort of service or, that sort of thing. And I've always I'm all for the games of table tennis and messing around. You need all of that too, of course. I'm not slamming that, but I'm like, if it's only that, well, the council can do that. Yeah. The church needs to make ready, men and women who will proclaim the gospel and carry something and be excited about being filled with the Spirit, carrying His presence and saying, okay, what's it look like for me to really live this out in my everyday life? And that there is an important call for us to really pursue that. And so I want to encourage anyone working with youth and students, get passionate about that, go after that, and do whatever you can to help equip people to do that well. Because I think the season we're coming into, and maybe we'll come on to this in a bit, what it feels like in the nation right now is really good news, and we're into an exciting season. Gosh, we're going to need so many people who have been trained and equipped and, can turn some of their passion into the skill that they need to lead really well. And so let's get equipping them.
And I'm sure you've got stories. I think of a lady, actually. I was preaching the National Prayer Breakfast in Burundi, and she came up to me very excitedly and she said, Simoni, Oranyibuka, Simon, do you remember me? I said, I'm sorry, I don't remember you. She said, 15 years ago, I was on your Scripture Union youth camp, and now I'm a member of Parliament. And I was like, yes, that's what we want, isn't it? So you've seen these guys come through the ranks. Give us a few of those examples. Yeah, no, totally.
And again, different ones in different places, whether it's the sports world or anything else as well. I mean, one that just jumps to mind now is a guy called Joel, who when I first met him, he was not following Jesus, and he came through all the young leaders training, came through One Life, came through all the stuff we were doing at St Andrews, ended up setting up a charity that got integrated into Tier Fund, which was amazing. And just watching him learn that, and off he went, it was really good. But a real call to business. And he's now a CEO of a business called CoCubed. And actually there's a whole bunch of Christians who work there. But they're really passionate about connecting the kind of entrepreneurial mindset to the global corporates. And they're amazing. They're just launching out into America. They're doing incredible work. And so they kind of help connect to kind of like a Coca-Cola, like global corporate, into pioneering innovative thinking to try and shake up new thinking and what's going on. But he's doing that with a whole bunch of people who are really passionate about doing it with Christian values at the deep core of it, and who want to try to be integrating and influencing some of these great corporates, with that kind of thinking. And then there's others as well. There's some of you might have, I don't know if you've ever had anyone on your podcast from Just Love, but Just Love is now a national organisation across the UK, working in lots of universities. And it was set up again by a young man who turned up to One Life. When he turned up, his name was Tom Christmas. And when he turned up, to be honest, he was quite quiet, pretty, beaten up by life. Things had not been straightforward for him and not easy at all. But confidence slowly grew. He went through one of the training things, was like a process for a year with One Life, and after that process, he got into Oxford University. And when he was at Oxford University, he set up Just Love because he wanted to mobilise students to take social transformation really seriously, and wanted students to start plugging the gaps in some of the cities where councils can't or others can't. So how do we tackle the major issues of society? Now it's in multiple universities around the country. There are hundreds of students involved in Just Love. And again, they're not just saying, we want just Christians to do this. They're then saying to those, they're trying to train people through Just Love, what would it look like for you to really live this out through the rest of your life? And what about if you went into business or politics or something? How are you going to live a life that brings social transformation? And interestingly, Tom doesn't lead Just Love anymore. Others lead it. And it's a great organisation. Look it up. But Tom now is in politics, and he's now, advising one of our MPs and kind of really trying to say, like, how do I put into practice what I've been calling out of students for the last couple of decades? And so stories like that are so encouraging, and actually when, many will know this, but just to encourage everyone and to try and encourage everyone who's listening, actually when you just sometimes invest in the ones and twos in front of you, and then the multiplication factor is extraordinary. So if you just take Tom, for example, lots of people will influence his life. It's not just me or One Life. There'll be a number of things, but they've all been elements that then have sparked something more, that then has multiplied out. And I still walk with Tom from time to time now. We walk the river here and discuss what he's doing in Parliament, and just kind of continue working that through. How does he integrate some of the things he's learned over the years into all of that space as he kind of grapples with faith in the political realm, and having set up a Just Love thing that's now multiplying amongst hundreds of students and thousands of people who are receiving the benefit of the service those students are giving.
Amen. So good. So One Life is still going strong. You founded it and then you released it. What were the next steps?
Yeah, so Liz Bewley now runs One Life, and actually it's based here in Hammersmith, which wasn't part of the original plan. But I'm founder, but I'm not involved anymore as trustees or anything. I just cheer it on as much as I can. But yeah, we felt called to get into ordination. And I was sort of tricked into that. A bishop sort of said, I was like, why would I go and get ordained? Because I'm already working with young people and training leaders. I'm doing everything I love. And they were like, well, we'll ordain you to do that. And there were a bunch of things around that. And I was feeling the nudge of God that actually I think, for me, ordination, it's not for everyone. It's in the ordination in the Church of England for me. But there was something almost monastic about it, which was, I feel like God's called me to, I think, a lifelong call into serving the church and being in the church with this great passion of training leaders for outside the church. So although my passion is training leaders for all the different spheres of society, I felt like God was saying, but your point of reference for that is to train from the church. And so for me, that equaled a long story, and I really felt God speak to me. I did go to a monastery. I try sometimes to take retreats, harder and harder with children at home and all those. That's a bit of a dry season for me in that at the moment, because I can't just go off for days on end and do retreats whilst we've got a younger family. But I was in a monastery for 3 days, and I was really frustrated, and I felt like, God, where are you? You're not speaking to me. And I'm like, I've made all this time for you and you should turn up, and felt really annoyed. But I actually got to the last day, and I was just praying in this chapel. And it was one of the clearest times I felt God speak to me. And I actually felt I felt him call me into the Church of England. And I just, that was simple it. It was just like an internal voice that felt like something from outside of me that I was not in my thinking. And at the time, I wasn't involved in the Church of England. And if anything, I was a bit like, oh, it's old. I'm not in for that. I'm kind of, give me something new and fresh and like, let's go. And I was involved with a different church stream that were wonderful. And I was thinking about going on their pastor stream and training. And I'd gone down the route of that, thinking, oh, that's what I'll do. So I was like pretty determined on my direction. And it definitely wasn't that. And I just felt like this interruption that I believe was the Holy Spirit saying, I'm calling you to the Church of England. That was it. There was no more instructions. I was like, oh my goodness, what do I do with that? And as sometimes happens with these things, for the couple of weeks after that, I had an unusual amount of people say to me, have you ever thought about getting ordained in the Church of England? It was almost like God was saying, there you go, there you go, there you go. And that hadn't happened before. And then suddenly it was, and I was like, I don't think I'm looking for this. It's just coming to me. And that was about 10 years before I ended up putting myself forwards for the church, into the Anglican Church. But I ended up getting ordained, trained in Cambridge for a couple of years. And then, again, slight surprising turn. We hadn't intended to come to London, but ended up coming to join the staff at HTB, and was delighted to be part of that, and was on the senior team for 6 of those 7 years, came in as a curate. And that was partly Nicky and Pippa Gumble, who were leading HTB at the time, had said, could you come and do what you've done with One Life, but for 20s and 30s? And so we launched something called Leadership College London, which again still exists and is happening. I'm still the director of that. So, and that trains distinctively Christian leaders for every sphere of society. Across all ages, we have different courses, but that was an element of what I did. But I also led one of the campuses and helped lead the church there and learned huge amounts. And again, felt I wanted to come to HTB because I wanted to be in a context that was going to stretch me, going to grow me. I wasn't sure that I wanted to be in a really big church because it's a really big church of several thousand people. But I was also like, well, actually, even if I don't really want that, if we're contending for awakening and revival, and if we want God to move and see things, then it's probably likely, if that happens, then the future is that there will be quite a few other bigger churches. We're going to need, churches are going to have to work out how do we do things well for more people, and how do we do discipleship well, all the challenges of a bigger church, the wonders of a church that are bigger, that can resource things about challenges. Let me go and learn as much as I can. And I learned huge amounts. I'm so grateful for that time. Huge amounts from brilliant people who are doing amazing things. And so we were there and launched LCL, Leadership College London. And then 3.5 years ago, I felt a call, quite a strong call. Sarah and I were praying, discerning into St. Paul's, to come and lead St. Paul's Hammersmith. And that has been a wild adventure. I mean, the call into that was just, again, extraordinary. I don't think I've ever felt so clearly called to a geographical location as St. Paul's. There was a number of prophetic words that happened. We actually felt a sense of calling to come here before the previous incumbent, Simon Down, who I was just with yesterday. He's, again, a brilliant man. He and his wife, Anna, has sort of reinvigorated this church. It had almost closed. It was falling down. It was on the Heritage Watch list. They did an incredible job of reinvigorating, planting into it when it was down to 10 people and literally about to be closed and turned into a car park. And they built it, rebuilt the roof, put on a new church centre, mobilised things, and did an amazing 20 years. And they were, I didn't know if they were moving or not, and I didn't know them at all. But we were like looking, thinking, I think we're called to lead that church, but I've got no relationship with them. Don't even know if they're moving. And we were getting to a place where it's like, it's right for us to go. We knew it wasn't right to stay at HTB long term. We were there for 7 years, which was longer than we thought we would be. But we knew and I was itching to plant a church. That's what I felt called to. But then a number of things happened. And just as we were like, Lord, you've got to move something, otherwise we need to look elsewhere. Almost like strong arming God. I get a phone call from Simon Downham saying, hey, I know we don't really know each other, but I've had a dream. And in the dream, you and Sarah were walking around St. Paul's Hammersmith. I just have you ever thought of leading a church in West London?
Oh, I love that.
And I was like, God, you've given him a dream.
Yes.
And that led to a number of big conversations. But also there were a number of prophetic things. I'll tell you one thing that's amazing. Sorry, I feel like I'm going on. I'll let you in with the question. But hopefully it's encouraging to other people who are waiting for a calling or waiting for something. It doesn't always come as bold as this. And, so this is a highlight moment for me. But if the dream wasn't enough, we were then discerning, like, is it right for us to come just because there's been a dream? We should be, should we be asking? I don't know. It's like Gideon saying, come on, turn this, please, turn that, please, do more, God, help prove it. But we were like, Lord, is it right? And a couple of friends who are real intercessors came down and were at the church. praying, and I got a phone call from one of them, and he said, "Oh, just at St. Paul's praying, I really feel it's right for you and Sarah to come here. This we feel really strongly on this." And he said, "I'm looking up right now at the church, and the thing I keep getting led to is that the clock on the tower has stopped." And he just said, "You know what? I feel like God's saying that there is going to be a change of leadership at this church, and the clock won't move again until there's a change of leadership." So I just heard that and thought, okay, fine, interesting. We'll see what happens, as you do with the prophetic. You weigh it, and Lord, you're going to have to do that because I can't move that clock. And then a week later, I'm in the staff meeting at H2B, and a relatively new curate who I didn't know well, and certainly didn't know that we were exploring this thing with St. Paul's. No one knew. It was very, very quiet. In fact, I think this is happening before that dream happened. So this was like really, really early doors as us discerning. And he walks up and he goes, "Pete, I've just had a picture from God. Can I share it?" Of course. And he said, "I see a picture of a church tower, and on the church tower is a clock, and it stopped. And I feel like God is saying he's coming to a point now where he's going to move things. The clock has stopped, but it's time to move." And he said, and it's interesting, the clock is stopped at about midnight. Anyway, I'm like, oh my goodness, I can't believe this after last week's prayer. Yeah. And we were aching to move, and it's like time to move. And he said it's about midnight. Now that phrase for me was really important, because when I was like 19, I'd been on a Christian camp, and there'd been a talk about Acts chapter 16, where Paul and Silas are locked in the inner cell. I love that story. And this preacher had basically said, that's like the church, like people are trying to lock the church away, silence the voice, get rid of it. And Peter and Silas have been locked away, silence the voice. And there they are praying and worshiping. And it says, when? About midnight. And he'd used this phrase, and he'd said, like, there is an about midnight moment coming where the church may be locked away. It might be at the darkest moment of the night, but as the church sings and prays and worships at about midnight, God is going to shake the foundations. And when God sets Paul and Silas free, he's going to set all the prisoners free. And there's going to be a move. And of course, the jailer and his whole family come to know Jesus on that very night. And I remember that talk, vivid. I've used it since and kind of built on it. So, but that, when he said it's about midnight, I was like, oh Lord, that's almost like, when I heard that talk for the first time, was like this revival cry. That's when I began reading revival history. That's when I began thinking, Lord, would you do it again? So I was like, oh, it's about midnight. It's this revival call. And that's our desire. Our desire is to see an awakening. Yeah. And so I phoned this friend who had been an intercessor and said, I've just had this picture. And he goes, oh, that's incredible, because, the clock is stopped at 1 minute past midnight. And I was like, no, you're joking. And I'm like, no, this is being elastic with the prophetic. Surely not. So I cancelled a meeting that afternoon and went down to Hammersmith. And I walked out of the station and I looked up at this clock, and there it was, stopped at 1 minute past midnight. And I just remember tears coming to my eyes and praying and saying, Lord, if this is your call, then we're up for it. Sorry. It was a powerful moment. It feels that now. And it was a very powerful moment of calling and knowing that it was going to come. And do you know what? Actually, the reality is it wasn't easy coming in here. Sure. There were a whole load of things that got in the way. And at one moment, it crashed. And for 6 months, it was off the table. And I was like, well, Lord, you gave a dream. You gave a picture. You spoke at about midnight. You said these things. And we were like, we've got to lay this down. As sometimes happens when you're waiting for a call, you have to lay down for a moment and say, okay, well, this is in your hands. And we got to a point where we were like, we've got to move. And we started looking at other things, and we were offered a couple of other jobs, and we were weighing up a job. And just as we were weighing up that job, the phone went again, and Simon was on the phone again saying, we've solved a few things have happened. And suddenly it was back on, and the rest is history. And we've come to St. Paul's and really feel like the Lord has called us to be here. And our desire is to see awakening. And, when Simon announced he was leaving, this is the last bit of that story, when Simon and Anna announced and they announced it online because it was during COVID times, within 24 hours of that announcement, the clock moved by 10 minutes, having not moved for 5 years. Wow. It moved by 10 minutes. So I get a phone call the day after that saying, no one's been up there, nothing's happened. It just moved by 10 minutes. And I think my friend who had that prophetic word kind of polished up his prophetic badge and said, there you go, I must be a prophet. But it was amazing because it was like a confirmation the declaration of a leadership change was happening, and this clock moved again. And we've been so blessed by Simon and Anna, who set us up brilliantly, and then the church who have welcomed us, and then we've just seen God do some amazing stuff.
Well, let's get on to that. So in Harrogate, the New Eye Leadership Conference, you shared the story. I've heard you repeatedly say awakening. So tell us about the Awaken flyer. Love this.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's, and I think just before I share that, I think there's you probably testifying it, but this is good news. There is the birth pains of awakening going on, I think, in this land. And I don't think it's just in the UK. I think there's other places too, but there's definitely something turning in the UK. I've just been on a call with about 50 church leaders before I came on here, and the constant narrative after Easter is more baptisms, more people coming to Christ, more young men sovereignly walking into churches, giving their lives to Jesus. It's probably not happening in every church, and if you're in a community where you're not seeing that yet, don't despair, but say, yes, God, yes, God, yes, God. Just say yes to the stories you're hearing and say, God, we want to partner with what you're doing. Just ask God to do it. Don't despair or resent it from other places, but go after it. But there's this sense in which something is stirring in the land, and people are reporting it. Even the press is reporting it. In fact, there was another Times article a couple of days ago written about 4 Gen Zers, and 3 of them are at St. Paul's Hammersmith, as the newspapers are getting in touch saying, why are you choosing to follow Jesus? And why are you choosing to live as a Christian when we thought the world was not going in this direction? But we have seen unbelievable amount of life and growth, as many churches have seen. We were overwhelmed on Easter Day. I mean, honestly, we were so overwhelmed, we were a bit unprepared, and we've got to learn lessons in that. We feel like we're catching up organizationally all the time because we're not expecting. We had 20 baptisms. There were at least 12, if not more, people gave their lives to Christ for the first time, and over 1,000 people turned up for church. We weren't expecting that at all. We thought this is going to be a big service, so we're going to get 600 chairs out, and we were just totally unprepared. And lots of people, confidence, bringing their friends, and this sort of stuff's happening all the time. And it's sovereign move of God. It's not like clever strategy. There's sovereign things happening. And we've been talking to the church about awakening the city. Our passion is, we want to see the church alive, encountering God, awakening cities. And our part is to try and awaken London. That's where we are. I use that word awaken, revival, a bit interchangeably. Last summer, we did this kind of church festival here in Hammersmith, and we named it Awaken. So I was very aware to that word awaken. We had tote bags with awaken. Everything was awaken. And I spot this flyer in the autumn that said awaken on the floor. And I picked it up, or it was on a counter of a shop, I think, actually. I picked it up. And, I was very excited. Like, look, it's happening everywhere. Like, God is doing something. And here's Awaken. There's a business called Awaken opening in Hammersmith. How interesting. And I looked at it, and then I quickly realized this is like a new age. It was doing tarot readings. It was all sorts of stuff. It was like a cafe come wellness center come kind of new age spirituality, stuff. And I was like, oh, that wasn't quite the awakening I imagined. But I remember praying there and then, Lord, would you awaken people to your love and to your mercy through this business? Slightly mad, right? And anyway, a week later, I get a text message come through from a mum who I knew from the school gate, who I hadn't seen for a few months because her daughter had gone to a different school, and we'd lost contact. I didn't know her that well, we just say hi and all that. She knew I was the local vicar, and that so do all the parents at the school gate. And she texts me and says, Pete, last week I had the most difficult week of my life, but in the midst of it, I had some kind of encounter with God/Holy Spirit/angel. I don't know how to describe it because I'm not a Christian, but what has happened to me is so significant I can't ignore it anymore. Is it possible to have a conversation with someone? And we had this walk around the park, and I said, well, what's happened? I'm just interested. She tells me the story. I won't go into all the details because it's like, but it included a very difficult court case where she was battling over some stuff and felt that there was real injustice going on, and felt that she hadn't been able to represent very well and didn't have the right evidence. And not being a believer or anything like that, she had this cross that her mother had thrust upon her and said, you take this today. And she was like, I don't believe that, mum, blah, blah, but she'd taken it. And in the moment of summation in this court case that she had been told she was going to lose, she touched the cross and thought, well, Jesus, if you're there, you've got to do something now. And literally within moments of that prayer, somebody stood up on her behalf who she had never met and produced a load of evidence and represented her and did a speech on her behalf that she was blown away by and doesn't know how that had happened. Now, I don't know if she doesn't know, is that some angelic presence? I don't know what had happened. I don't know how that intervention had happened. But she was blown away and felt the presence of God in that moment in the courtroom. She knew, and she would describe this, she knew that Jesus was with her and had answered her prayer. And she was totally overwhelmed by this experience of what was going on. She walked out of the courtroom. She bought a Bible that very afternoon. She went home and started reading it and met Jesus in the words of Scripture and was like, okay, Jesus, it's all about you. So she's telling me this story and I'm like, yeah, you're right, it's all about you. And then she says, but I've got a problem. And I'm like, what's the problem? And she goes, I've just opened a business in Hammersmith called Awaken. And I was like, oh, tell me more. And then I said to her, I've been praying for you and your business. And she's like, really? I said, yeah, this is my prayer. And she's like, well, this is the problem. She said, I am so convinced it's all Jesus, all Jesus. She said, I've spent my life investing in New Age practice. She's not just dabbled in this, she's led this stuff. She's brought tribes over from other nations to teach people how to do rain dances and to do different New Age spiritualities, tarot. And she's set this business up with a friend to kind of, to go at it in Hammersmith. And she's like, but now, how can I do that? Because it's all Jesus. And I know that undermines everything. And I've got to rethink everything. And I just, she couldn't believe the story. I couldn't believe the story. God is up to something sovereign. He's doing it again and again and again in people's lives. And he's even breaking in on people like her who have had strong beliefs in other spiritual practices, who have now been arrested by the things of Jesus and are going, okay, I can't carry on in that direction. And, she's amazing. And, you can imagine that's not easy. And that's really challenging. She's had to change and reorientate her whole belief system, her whole life. In the end, she's actually sold out of the business because she just felt it's so complicated and too complicated. She began by thinking, maybe I can just bring Jesus into this in the mix of everything. And she's just like, no, I can't. This has got to either totally orientate around Jesus and her business partner's not ready for that, or I can't do it. And so she's ended up selling out of it. But major life change. And again, we're seeing that in many people's lives. We're seeing Muslims having dreams, coming to church, saying, I've met Jesus, who is he? And being led to Christ. We baptize Muslims on Sunday, Easter Sunday. And that I've never known that in this country. I've heard of that in other countries, right? But I've not heard of that in England. And it's happening in just stunning ways. One of those, as you know, in those stories is that means that her family have kicked her out. And you hear of that in Muslim, in the 1040 window or something, you hear of that there, don't you? And lots of our beautiful Iranian brothers and sisters who are now part of our communities here because they're escaping their country, but there's a revival happening in Iran right now. The church is exploding there. Yeah. And some of them are having to escape. And, we baptized one of those on Sunday, amazing, but just through persecution, but have stood for Christ. But even people in England. So this one of the people in our church is, that's her family have kicked her out and she's had to find a new family now. But she has so encountered Jesus that it's like, I have to follow him despite the loss and the challenge of that. It's I look at that with awe and I'm like, well, Jesus, only you could do that. Only you can sustain that. And Lord, we need you more than ever.
Yeah. So good. Tell us about the youth off their own back saying we want to give out Bibles. Yeah. We run a discipleship year here. And, actually, this is a nice little, bookend to our podcast because so my brother, who sadly died, he had two little boys at that time. And again, for those of you listening, you go through real times of brokenness. That was a real time of brokenness. And when he died, he left behind his amazing wife, Sophie, and Noah, who was 2, and James, who was only 3 months old. And, he, still questions about that and the pain of those moments. You're like, oh, Lord, surely it was better for him to stay on earth. But, part of the wonder of that story, not that we can resolve all of those questions easily, but James came and did our discipleship year. So my nephew jumped into that. And, he's just a passionate evangelist. And again, I think this Gen Z generation has suddenly got a boldness about them. I'm seeing it everywhere. There's a boldness to say, well, if Jesus is there and the Holy Spirit's moving, he's clearly doing it in my life. I want to multiply that everywhere. And so James is like asking people all the time, where are you up to with Jesus? All on the street. And he just said, one day with another guy in the church, we want to start doing something on the streets. We're going to give out Bibles. And I just thought,
oh yeah, you can have permission, go and have a go. They funded the first few Bibles themselves. Like, we didn't do that as a church, all those things. And I love that in the church, when it just things grow up from the grassroots. It's not like that I'd perhaps just say that, don't wait for the church. Obviously you want to work, collaboratively. You don't want to kind of tread on toes too much, but equally, like, get out there and get on with it. Don't wait for the church to set up everything so you can do it. Just like if God calls you to do something, and God was speaking to him about handing out Bibles on the street. So it's like, okay, go and do it. And they funded the first few, and that's been funded in other ways since. And we've done some of that from the church and some of that from other places. But they started giving out Bibles, and there was real fruit. Suddenly, like, people were taking Bibles, first in the dozens, then their hundreds. And I mean, and then more young people started getting involved. And now there's like an evangelism team. And again, it's just sort of under the radar, but there's just hungry people who are able to pray for people, on the streets, giving out Bibles. And now we've given out, in the last year, we've given out over 6,000 Bibles on the street in Hammersmith. And that's usually once or twice a week. And they often do it before our evening service. So they're able to say to people, well, if you've just given your life to Jesus, get along to church now. It's down the road just there. Or if you want to come sometime. And it is a regular occurrence that people now walk into the church saying, I got a Bible 3 weeks ago on the street. I've been reading about it. I want to find out more. Can I come to service? Yes, you can. Come on in. And people are reading the Bible like never before. People are really interested. And so there's, I thought this strategy is ridiculous. That'll never happen. And maybe 10 years ago, everyone would have gone, no thanks, no thanks, no thanks. Now they will get rid of 100 Bibles in 10, 15 minutes. Bang, it's gone. People are hungry. They want to learn. Yeah. They're asking them. And they're often leading people to Christ on the streets. That happened they went out on Easter Saturday, and they were just knocking around Hammersmith and on the green, and they led some people to Jesus. They gave out loads and loads of Bibles. Just, people are hungry. They're responding, and there's something going on that means that there's a spiritual openness, which means I think people are spiritually open to all kinds of things. But there is then a call for us as the church to be confident with the gospel. You probably will have seen some of the stats, but on January the 29th, a tipping point happened in London, and it's happening in the nation. But the London stats that I can remember is that suddenly over 50% of people now believe in a God of some kind. And that was the first time that had happened in 5 years on the London statistics. And so, 1 in 2 people are going to be like, yeah, who is this God then? Who is this God? And some of them are discovering him, some of them trying to look for him in different places. And I think this is a season right now where this is an amazing thing. There's a move of the Spirit going on, which is kind of awakening people to spiritual reality. They're hungry for it. Atheism is dying. It really is. There's less ardent atheists. And again, another person walked into church. I watched him walk in and out of a service about 6 times a few months ago at the back. And I'm like clocking this guy, like, what is going on for that guy? And he walked up to me at the end of a talk I'd done and shook my hand. And he just said, thank you. I just want to say thank you for making an open space for me to come and check this out. He said, I've been an atheist all my life, but I've recently started asking questions whether I'm actually right or not. And this is the first time I've ever stepped in a church. And I had to keep leaving because I kept thinking, I'm mad. What am I doing? I'm going mad. But he said, every time I stepped out of the church, I felt like I had to walk back in because there's something going on here. And I now know I need God. That's what he said to me. Amazing.
Beautiful. And these encounters are happening in every sort of strata of society, isn't it? There's rich people around Hammersmith. There's lots of poor people. There's people in and out of prison. I remember you telling a story about a drug dealing guy.
Yeah. His backstory, and this has happened with a few, but and I can tell his story. He's been quite open about it now. But he's called Matthew, and he was quite a successful drug dealer. He'd been in and out of prison 3 times, so maybe that's not successful because he's been caught. But he'd done well and made money. He had cars and a flat and lots of stuff out of drug dealing. So he was doing well, and he had a weekend about 18 months ago where he would describe starting to feel agitated and starting to ask questions of like, hold on a sec, is God there? Is God there? So like the Spirit of God was knocking on his heart. He wouldn't describe it that way at the time, but that's what was going on. He got so agitated, he walked into a church near where he was and asked to ask him questions. Anyway, I don't know where that church was. I don't know what happened in that conversation, but he walked out of that church thinking that's a load of rubbish, don't like that. And he would say he was given a load of bland answers that he felt were just politically correct, okay? So, oh gosh, we need to get more bold, right? He was just like, don't give me fluff. I want to know the real deal, okay? He walks out of that church, walking down the path thinking that's a load of rubbish. And but as he's walking down the path, he felt a voice inside him saying, no, you need to go to that church in Hammersmith. And at the time, he's in London, but he's 13 miles away. So 13 miles transport in London is like going to a different city. It's a long way. But anyway, he makes the journey to Hammersmith and walks in on a Monday, and he meets one of an ordinand, someone training to be a priest, a young guy, and says, "Can I have a conversation with you?" And this guy, Ben, just starts talking to him and just shares the love of Jesus and shares the gospel and what Jesus has done. He then says, "I need Jesus in my life." And so Ben leads him to Jesus, leads him through a prayer of commitment to Jesus. Immediately, Matthew breaks down weeping. And he's not a guy who cries, okay? He would not say he was an emotional guy before. He was a hardened kind of into his football, hooligan stuff, drugs, everything. He starts weeping and immediately starts confessing a load of his sins. And again, no one told him to do that. Ben wasn't like, now confess all his sins, but he just starts speaking out all this stuff. It's almost like he's getting clean. The Holy Spirit is just wanting to clean him. So he has this radical encounter with God, and it has changed his entire life. He goes away from that place. And of course, we were walking along with him. Ben did an amazing job, and he came through an Alpha course and everything, but he stops his drugs life, and he's never had another job. So he trained to do some, like, just a coffee shop job, which was like paying him like London minimum wage, so he was like, his income dropped dramatically, everything dropped. So major sacrifices, but he hung on to Jesus. And this is a radical change. And his life has been utterly transformed. He now works for us part-time. He's like what we call a verger in the church. He helps kind of, around some of the services. And he's amazing because he doesn't just do that job. He's leading people to Christ all the time. And there's been a couple of amazing moments where there was another moment. We had been praying specifically because there was some drug dealing going on around our church. It's really, it's an interesting, very varied environment. Like, Hammersmith is, like you say, there's some nice bits, but there's a lot of bits as well that are really challenging. I've found myself in the middle of gangs having fights. There's drugs dealing regularly around the church, all that sort of stuff. And we were praying for that. And within the week that we had been praying, Lord, would you lead these drug dealers to you? One of them was on their knees weeping on the steps of the church, not knowing why he was there. He hadn't come because he was looking for Jesus. He was just weeping. And who was on shift? Matthew.
Yes.
So Matthew goes out, and the guys, "You won't understand, you people from the church, you won't understand, blah, blah." Matthew says, "Try me." They have a conversation. Matthew leads that guy to Christ, who then, within the week, went into rehab to get off it. He was in a drug addiction, had been out of prison, was selling drugs, but had fed up with his life. Yeah. So isn't that amazing? And just last weekend, Simon, you'll love to hear this. You haven't heard this bit, but we have a prison ministry. We go in there from time to time, and Matthew preached his first sermon. And it's stunning redemption, isn't it?
Yeah.
He can go into prison that he was in as an inmate, carrying the good news of the gospel, and can preach a sermon 4 times in a row. His first sermon he preaches in the prison that he was held in, and he preaches that sermon. And I know at least one person gave their life to Christ. Others were impacted. And, God has redeemed his life, and it's multiplying through his son that he has a beautiful relationship with. And I had a lovely conversation with on Easter Sunday. He started coming to church now with him. And just something rebuilding of the life of the gospel in someone that's impacting their whole world. And now they're multiplying that story into other people's lives. Oh my goodness, amazing.
Hey folks, as you listen to this, I'll be halfway up a mountain in Burundi on a bike, slogging my guts out with a very sore backside in the blistering heat with 15 other people. We're doing 700 kilometers this week, 38,000 feet of elevation up and down the mountains to raise money for our critical work here in what is still the hungriest country in the world, the second poorest right now. It is so desperately needed. The poverty is extreme. So it'd be a great encouragement if you wanted to sponsor us. Money goes such a long way out here. You can go to greatlakesoutreach.org/bike. And the link will be in the show notes. Or maybe you want to join us next year. It's pretty much guaranteed to be the first week of June. Each year we've done that. It's the 10th tour this year. So you can do that same link. That's greatlakesoutreach.org/bike if you want to sponsor us or sign up for next year's tour. All right. Thank you so much. Let's get back to the podcast. Oh, mate, I just want to carry on listening to all these stories. But what would you do as your parting shot, parting encouragement, stirring us up? I think that we're so on the back foot in this nation. We're called to be on the front foot with gospel confidence. You and your gang are full of that because you're seeing so much fruit. So how can we all jump on that bandwagon?
I think, I want to encourage everyone. We are in a moment that is happening, and you may not be seeing where you are. I know that it won't be true for every church. So just first of all, I said earlier, don't celebrate the stories. I want to encourage everyone, listen to stories, hear the stories, and celebrate the stories. And that's why I love this podcast, because you're trying to provoke what is actually going on. It doesn't always get reported. But here's the reality, okay? So celebrate the stories and tell the stories. One of the things we do here is tell stories all the time, because stories help people understand what it looks like in concrete terms. It helps people this is what's possible, this is what can be. So tell stories and celebrate stories, and get reading stories. And so I'm always and still reading story revival books of old. Read stories about the Welsh revival, read about the Hebridean revival, read what happened in Wesley's day, read what happened in the Great Awakenings, read some of those stories and then turn them into prayers. So if people want to get hold of things, then start going after that, because this is a moment in our nation right now. I would say we are not in revival. I've heard some people saying, we're in revival. I've watched a news report on CNN where they're saying UK is in revival. I've had messages from friends and pastors in America who are saying, I hear that UK is revival. I personally wouldn't say we're in revival yet, and that's probably a different talk at another time. I think we're in the birth pains of awakening, and there are pains within that too. When you're giving birth to something, it can feel painful. It's like, when's it coming? When's it coming for me? There can feel challenges too. So let's not underplay that there's going to be challenges, because whenever there's been revival or awakening, there's often challenge too, and that's what happens in the place of birth. But we're in birth pains of awakening, and it's almost like God has heard the prayers of saints for decades, maybe centuries, who have been praying for this land, and something is waking up so that the Gen Zers are all coming to Christ. There are more young men coming to Christ than ever before. And here's evidence of it. It's not just anecdotal stories that we're telling or you're hearing in this podcast. It's census material. It's published polls that are going on. There's the Quiet Revival that's been published by Bible Society that just takes together some of the YouGov polls that is basically showing that there is upturn, major decrease in atheism, major upturn in Christianity, more people going to church than ever before. Church numbers are bouncing back. Easter Sundays are getting filled, more baptisms than ever before. And it's God is doing something. It's not a clever church strategy or a clever leader. It almost feels like leaderless. It feels like there's a generation who are stepping up, going after something. And now's a moment to say, yes, Lord, let's go for this. We're hungry for that. And we're saying yes to the birth pains of this awakening. Let's go after something. I wrote something 12 years ago about a church I long to see in 10 years' time. And one of the lines in it was that there would be stories the media can't ignore anymore. Yes. Now, 10 years ago, all you saw in the media was negativity about Christianity and the church. Demise, it's rubbish, it's over, God's dead, blah, blah, blah. That was the media story. Now, I think almost every weekend, in the weekend supplements, there's why are the Gen Zs turning to Jesus? There are other stories and news outlets that are going, we've got to tell there's something happening. So this is there's something going on, and this is really exciting, because whether you're in your 80s and 90s and you've been praying for years, but perhaps a bit jaded because you heard about revivals and awakening, but it hasn't happened, and is this really, or whether you're early doors, you're just coming to know Jesus, or you're beginning to explore faith and you're listening to this, I don't know what your story is, but now's a moment to say, yes, Lord, would you bring about this awakening? We want to partner with you. We want to tell the story. We want to tell your story. We want to celebrate what's going on, and we say yes to this. So that would be my parting charge. Let's say yes to what's going on. Let's partner with the story. Let's pray it in, and let's say, come on, God, would you do something? There's a moment in history that's going on, and we've got to jump into it now.
Yes, amen. Oh, love it. By the way, guys, the report, the Quiet Revival, I'm just quoting, of adults surveyed, 12% reported they attended church of any denomination at least once a month last year, compared with 8% back in 2018. So that's 7 years ago, and 50% up. In numerical terms, that's growth from 3.7 million in 2018 to 5.8 million in 2024. That's an increase of 56%. I'll just do one more quote. This dramatic growth is owed largely to younger generations, it says. In 2018, 4% of 18 to 24-year-olds reported they attended church monthly, compared with 16%, fourfold increase in 2024. For men, this increased from 4% to 21%, and for women from 3% 10% to 12%. Ooh, so it is very, that's not anecdotal, that's statistical. So guys, that's why I want to get Pete on, because he is living it right now. He's in the thick of it. He's struggling to handle the growth going on, and being blown away by God's faithfulness and well, just extravagance in blessing him with loads of people coming through the doors. So Pete, mate, I just thanks so much for being with us, and we can continue to cheer you on at St. Paul's Hammersmith and all that's going on in London. It's beautiful. We want to see it through the nation. We want to see it into Europe. May this be a season across the nations of massive harvesting and discipling for God's glory. Amen.
Amen. Simon, thank you. It's a privilege, and thank you for what you're doing. It's like your constant faithfulness in provoking this good story and encouraging us all is like, that's inspiring, and I'm personally really thankful. Thank you.
Brilliant. Oh, mate. Wonderful. Well, listen, folks, I think you're going to want to share this podcast with different people. So do gossip it around to your mates. I want to thank Adam Thomas Steer for the editing, Mike Sandman for the mixing. Great if you could give us a good review on Spotify, iTunes. That's a bonus. It means more people are going to listen to it. And next week, we've got a very different story, but another fantastic guest. In the meantime, God bless you. Have a good one, and toodaloo.